there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer really standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Please remember to visit the website podcastufo.com for past episodes, blogs, and forums. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to the show. And the announcer just lied there. I'm not live Wednesday evening at 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm actually broadcasting from Russia. You regular listeners know this. I gave some warning. So today's actually Tuesday too. So we're a day early and we're not $1 short, but we are in the afternoon Eastern Standard Time, 1 to 3 p.m., which is actually 8 to 10 p.m. My time here. I'm at Moscow time if you want to check it out. I'm actually at the Black Sea. It's a beautiful area and having a good time. I'm here for 42 days in total. So I'll be running my shows on Wednesday afternoon from 1 to 3 p.m. That's when you can catch me live on YouTube. And I have gotten some email from the people in Europe and they're real excited about it because they can actually watch it live. So thank you if you are listening live, and the chat room's available as well, and I'll be checking messages on that throughout the show. So thanks so much, and we are ready to get started. Alejandro couldn't make it today. He'll be back next week. He's going to be joining us live. It's just because I had to do it the day early that he could not make it. Now, we have the one and only Kevin Randle. Real excited to have him. He and I are going to be talking about a document now noted on the webpage Midnight in the Desert that we have to announce. This was something that was released to Heather Wade on Midnight in the Desert, and we're going to be talking about that. It's been making a lot of buzz, and Kevin had a top secret security clearance. He knows how these documents are supposed to be written and has a lot of great information on it. And Kevin, welcome to the show. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. And you're in Russia.
I'm in Russia, and I just, what did you say I did? I compromised your security clearance?
I was about to say that you just compromised me. The NSA now is seeing that I'm getting phone calls or Skype messages from the former Soviet Union, now Russia. So yeah, I'm probably dead in the water here. Thanks a lot, fella.
Sorry about that. But I'm so glad to have you on. And I have said this many times before on my show, and actually when I do Alejandro Rojas's news on openminds.tv, as well as you are the go-to guy, I think, in a lot of cases when it comes to getting the true story on what's going on. And I was really happy to see that you explored this document that has been going, I want to say, semi-viral in the UFO community. So let's talk about it. When's the first time you heard about it and all that?
I heard about it at 4:10 p.m. Central Daylight Time on Wednesday, June 14th. How's that for pinning it down? I was going to have Steve Bassett on my show, A Different Perspective, which is hosted on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. And I couldn't make contact with him. And so we had to fall to or drop back to our fallback position, which is put up one of the other shows. And he called me at 4:10 and said, "Is this too late?" And I said, "Yeah, the ship has sailed, pal." And he said, "Well, we've been chasing this document." And he told me about it and where it was. And he wanted to get on the radio right then and there and talk about it. And I'm thinking, I haven't even seen it yet. I don't want to have anything to do with it because it's MJ-12. And I'm pretty well convinced that MJ-12 is a hoax. All of it is a hoax. There's really nothing to it of any value. But I wanted to see the document because it could be that I was wrong on that. So yeah, I mean, you have to see it. So he told me where it was. I downloaded it immediately from Heather site, Midnight in the Desert, and looked at it. And the first thing I saw, it says ultra top secret. And I'm thinking, that just doesn't make good sense to me, ultra top secret, because Ultra was a program for the British during the Second World War, where they were talking about or attempting to intercept and decode top secret Nazi communications for the war effort. But it also says at the bottom of the thing, read and destroy. And I'm thinking, well, if it says read and destroy, which is a really dumb instruction, but how did this one escape from that? When you destroy classified materials, and especially secret and top secret materials, you're required to fill out documentation to verify it has been properly destroyed. And so if this was read and destroy, he would have had to, I probably should say he or she, but it's probably a guy, would have had to document its destruction. So he lied on a government document about its destruction and then spirited it out of the facility. Top secret material requires storage in a vault, by the way, not just a safe or a reinforced filing cabinet. It requires a vault. So taking a document out like that is something even worse than stealing a secret or a confidential document. So this was the first thing that struck me, but I went on and I looked at it. I looked at the way it was constructed, and the other thing is, on classified material, there's always a stamp at the top and the bottom that gives the classification top secret or secret or confidential. It's at the top and the bottom of all pages. This thing only had the classification at the top page. So that's a problem. It said the authors, and there was a big thing across it that said classified. The authors weren't listed, and I'm thinking, I can't think of a reason that you'd have a document created and you can't list who the authors were, because of course if they'd listed the names, we'd have been able to maybe find out who they were and what they were doing, or would be unable to find them in a position where they would be creating a document like this. And then I got to the Roswell stuff, and it just really fell apart from there. I think the date says something like 07 July 47, which or 07 July, 1947, which is the way the things are dated on the MJ-12 documents, but that's not standard military dating format. The information inside the Roswell part of this document was just horribly inaccurate. It said, for example, that Mac Brazel had called the sheriff's office at 5 o'clock in the morning. Well, A, Mac Brazel didn't have a telephone, and B, we know from testimony of a number of people that he took the stuff to Roswell. And he got there early enough that he could interrupt Jesse Marcel's lunch. Jesse Marcel was eating lunch over at the Officers Club, according to what Jesse Marcel said when he got the call from the sheriff. So the timing didn't work out. There's all kinds of things like that in the Roswell part of it. They just didn't make any sense. We move on to the Aztec part of it, and it doesn't really fit with the information we know about that. I believe Aztec is a hoax. I don't believe there was anything there. I know that I am in disagreement with a lot of different people on that, but I think the Aztec crash is a hoax as well. So if this is included in the MJ-12 document, in this MJ-12 document, well, that tells me that it's a hoax. But then we get to the part where there's an interview with an extraterrestrial biological entity. And so I read through that. It said it was an interview conducted by several interviewers, lasts a few pages. But the thing that leaped out at me was they said, well, why do you come here? And part of the answer was, well, we like your trees. Right, yeah. And I'm thinking, yeah, do you like the Tibetan music and the strawberry ice cream as well? You know, the responses by this alien being were awfully colloquial English. And I can't think that they would be talking in the vernacular of the English, even no matter how smart they were. So there were a lot of little things like that, and that was my first gut reaction to it. But then I went through and looked through it carefully, and it became even worse. The mistakes were just legion. The text didn't make any sense. The way it was written, it wasn't written in the way a document like this would be written at the high levels it was. It's riddled with errors and inconsistencies. So my conclusion was, after having an opportunity to read it carefully, and I communicated this to Steve Bassett as well on Wednesday, I think, when we first talked about it, and then we talked about it again on Saturday for my show. But I told him that I thought the thing was a hoax, and I approach these things because I know people are going to say, well, you don't believe MJ12, therefore anything that says MJ12 you're going to reject out of hand. And I'm always of the mind of the prospector, which is you always have to look. You don't expect to find gold in certain places, but you have to look, because in case it's there, you want to be able to find it. And so every time something like this surfaces, I look to see if it is something that is legitimate. And this thing suffers from all the problems with the other MJ12 documents, which begins with a lack of provenance. We don't know who the guy was who stole it. We don't know how it got into Heather Wade's hands, although we do know that, according to her, she knows the guys personally who sent it to her, and she finds them reliable, which is completely possible, I suppose. But the document is just outrageously fraudulent. I don't know how else to say it.
Well, let me ask you a couple of questions about it. First of all, have you ever heard of a situation where a document does say read and destroy?
No.
Is that a possibility that the government would have ever been involved in a document like that?
I think there are. I always thought the eyes only classification, Secretary of Defense eyes only, kind of took care of that sort of circumstance. There possibly could be materials at the highest level of classification that tell people to read it and then destroy it immediately, so it cannot get out into the public.
Yeah.
But in that case, we wouldn't have any of these sort of things to look at.
That's right.
I've never come across anything like that, which is not to say it doesn't exist. It's just in my career, I never saw anything like that. And to be perfectly candid, for the most part in my career, I only handled secret material. I rarely came across top secret material that, in my positions, I was one of the few people in the organization, and by that I mean when I was in the Air Force, the either the wing or the group level activity, and when I was in the Army at the battalion level, I never came across. I rarely came across top secret materials. The nature of my jobs didn't require me to have top secret materials. I did, in fact, attend a defense intelligence school where you had to have a top secret clearance to go because they were dealing with top secret materials and we were getting top secret briefings. And I know of a circumstance of a military museum, and I won't say where there was a secret room, a top secret room, where you had to have a top secret clearance to get in to see the stuff because of what it was and what it would suggest. And I did get a chance to get into that room. And the interesting side part was the curator took me out into a display area where they had a lot of different military equipment displayed, and one of them had been shot up, and he wanted to know the caliber of the bullets that had gone through there. And I'm thinking, why don't you know this? But it looked to me like it had been hit by 50 caliber rounds. So I said, that's what I said to him. I think it looks like a 50 cal to me. I don't know why they didn't have somebody else that could have told them that. So, or maybe they were just getting a survey of opinion on something like that. But the point is, when we look at this stuff and you start dealing with stuff at the very highest levels, the people who are allowed to see it is very, very limited. First of all, you have to have a top secret clearance. Second of all, you have to have a need to know. And third of all, there's often a code word that goes with it, and you have to be code word cleared to see it as well. And to use the example from this, it should have said top secret ultra as opposed to ultra top secret. But to see the document, then you would have had a top secret ultra clearance, and that would have been noted. And if you didn't have the top secret ultra clearance, you wouldn't be allowed to see the document, even though you have a top secret clearance. One of the other things that's been mentioned about this is the paragraphs aren't noted. In a lot of the especially the top secret materials, each paragraph will begin with a little parenthetical statement. It'll say like TS for top secret or S for secret, C for confidential, to allow the reader to know the level of classification of that specific material, especially if the material is made up of all different levels of classification. The document will be classified at the highest level of any of the information in it, but all the information doesn't have to be top secret. There's also something else called no foreign. So it means no foreign dissemination. And so you'd see TS-no FORN, no foreign. And this doesn't have anything like that on it at all. None of those sorts of things are there. And I would expect to see some of that in a document like this.
Sure. Now, a couple of things about this particular document. First of all, is it supposed to have the appearance of being mimeographed or something? What is it? It's very hard to read. And by the way, any listener can read this. It's on, of course, Midnight in the Desert, but it's also on our website, linked under the show notes. Do you think it's a mimeograph?
I'll interrupt to say, and you can go to my blog, www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com, and click on the link, and it'll take you to Midnight in the Desert, so you can read the documents that way too.
Yes.
That was just a plug for my blog,
Don't worry,
if I'm going to do these things, I'm going to plug my blog, doggone it.
Yes, and as I said earlier, I truly believe if you want to find out if a story about UFOs is real or not, and you want to get a really good perspective on it, please do go to Kevin's website, because that's where I always end up landing when I'm looking into something. And there's some really, really great information. I'll do that plug for you, Kevin, because
thank you.
I really, really think your website is very important in this field. So, first of all, what's your thoughts about the mimeograph look?
I don't think it's mimeographed, and it shouldn't be mimeographed because it's a top secret document, so the printing of it would be restricted. It doesn't look to me like it's mimeographed. It clearly has been Xeroxed like 9,000 times.
And do you think that was done on purpose to make it look, I don't know, more authentic in some type of way?
I think it was done so that they could cut and paste stuff together.
I see.
And I think that's the purpose of it. I cannot see a document, and I'm looking at the second page of it, and it says authors, and it's stamped classified. I cannot see them doing anything like that. If the authors were classified, the names would have been left out. They wouldn't have put them in there. There's no reason for the names not to be there. I mean, we've got a top secret document. It's given us all the information, and we don't get to know who the authors of the document are. That's preposterous, absolutely preposterous. That's the first clue right there. And then, as I said, you look at the classifications. There's a sheet here, and it's basically blank. That's classified. It doesn't really work that way. It should say this page left intentionally blank, which I always laugh about, because if you've written on it, this page left intentionally blank, it's not in fact blank, it's got writing on it. But it's included in the document, and what's interesting is the top secret at the top of this page is reversed. It's a mirror image. And I wondered about that, because the rest of it seems to be written properly. So, there's a lot of little dumb things like that. The dating format is wrong for the military. And the other thing is, I don't know why it would be ultra top secret as opposed to top secret MJ12 or whatever the lousy classification there is using this week. There's places where it says classified where it really shouldn't. I mean, it says classified and this is ultra top secret. Well, that's the classification. I've seen cover sheets that you put on the classified material, and the ones I was most familiar with were sort of a bright pink, and it said classified cover sheet. I've seen others that say top secret cover sheet and secret cover sheet and that sort of thing. I've never seen anything quite like this. So there are just so many little things wrong. When you're a civilian, I guess, someone who has not worked with the military classification or the classified materials, and you're trying to duplicate something like that, there's all kinds of little things that you don't know. Or you wouldn't notice. A great example is if you watch movies and you see people in military uniforms, you can often realize they don't know. The uniforms aren't quite right. The distinctive insignia are placed improperly. Sometimes the ribbons are reversed. Sometimes the ribbons are upside down, meaning the highest ribbon is at the bottom instead of at the top, and that sort of thing. So you look at that, and it's just things civilians don't realize. They've seen pictures or things, and they put it all together. And I think this is what we have here is kind of a conglomeration of stuff. I think the source material for the Aztec stuff especially is William Steinman's book, UFO Crash at Aztec. I think that's part part of the source material for this. They didn't have Scott Ramsey's book, which is Incident at Aztec, or the Aztec UFO Incident, I'm sorry. And they didn't have Scully's book, which is Behind the Flying Saucers, which are the 3 books about the Aztec crash. So they obviously had the Steinman book and was working from that.
I do want to talk to you about the Aztec crash later, but one of the things I was thinking about when I opened the document and started reading through it, it said that people's names would not be written down, and then further down in the document it had people's names listed. Was that something I just don't understand, or what were they trying to do with that?
They were trying to cover themselves because they didn't know the names of some of the people who would have been key players. Jesse Marcel's name is out there for everybody to see. Yeah. So you can put his name in there. But other names would be a little bit more obscure. So to cover themselves, they say, well, we've changed some of the names or left them out, which means they just didn't know it. One of the other things, and your question kind of keyed that for me. It said that Twining had gone to Roswell, Lieutenant General Twining had gone to Roswell and relieved Blanchard of his command. And this is something that people outside the military wouldn't understand. Blanchard was not relieved of his command at any point. If he was, we would have documentation, because that's a really big deal. What it should have said was that Twining had gone to Roswell and assumed command because he was the senior officer present for this particular incident. That would have made sense to me, but saying he relieved Blanchard of command, that's not right. He did not relieve Blanchard of command. And I know of a number of circumstances, and going back to my experience in Vietnam, I once was the company commander simply by virtue of being the senior officer on the base. I was a 19-year-old warrant officer. Oh, wow. And we had to evacuate a lot of the aircraft. I always like to say I was the senior surviving officer, which is sort of true and sounds really dramatic, but the fact of the matter is we'd evacuated most of the aircraft, and because my aircraft broke, we had been flying all day, and they'd sent out a new bunch of co-pilots. I was the aircraft commander. I sent out a bunch of new co-pilots, and the co-pilot said, should I check the tail rotor? And I said, no, we've been flying all day. And he climbed up there and checked it anyway, and the linkage fell apart in his hands. So we weren't going anywhere. So we were left behind. So I was the senior officer left on the base in our company area at the time. So they would come to me with questions for the 12 or 14 hours. I was the company commander. But the point is, I did not relieve anybody of command. I merely assumed command simply because I was the senior officer present.
So it was just that wording was totally off.
Yes, and had Blanchard been relieved, that would have ended his career. If you get relieved for cause from a military unit like that, you're done.
Wow.
You would be out of the service quickly. We've just had an example that we may see something like that, and that was the collision between the container ship and the U.S. destroyer.
Yeah.
The captain of that destroyer could be in deep trouble, especially because 7 of his sailors were killed. His career might be over at this point, depending on the circumstances. And
I can't even imagine how that whole thing happened with today's technology and equipment. Was he texting?
Well, he was obviously. I believe he was. I don't know where he was. I was going to say I think he's on the bridge. He and a number of other sailors were injured, and they were medevaced out. I don't know where he was. And even if he was texting, there should have been other people looking at the radar scope, and the guy steering the ship should have been looking around, and there should have been eyes out there to see this container ship, because it's not like it's a little tiny thing that was going to sneak up on you. But I don't understand. But the point is, he will probably find himself relieved, and he'll probably find his career pretty much over. If you have a major mistake like that, you're pretty well screwed. And so if Blanchard had been relieved of his command, as this document says, Blanchard would have been pretty well screwed. And we know that he ended up as a 4-star general. He was the vice chairman of vice Air Force chief of staff, 4-star general, who died of a heart attack at the Pentagon. So obviously his career was not hurt by this event in Roswell, which suggests again that Twining didn't relieve him of his command. And there's really no evidence that Twining actually went to Roswell. He was in New Mexico on some other things, and there's really no evidence that he went to Roswell in any of the documentation. So you can pretty well realize that's another major error. But to answer your question, I think the reason that they said that some of the names have been changed, or names have been changed, or names have been left out is simply because they didn't have access to the information, or didn't know where to get the information, and they didn't want to put a name in there that would be proven false, so they just left it out.
Yeah, Kevin, when my impression, and this is just an armchair person that knows nothing about military. I know nothing about military documents or top secret documents at all, nothing. But my impression when I was reading through it is, why in any circumstance would they jumble all these different incidences together in one document? That's what didn't make sense to me. Is that something that would be done?
If you're trying to provide a complete overview of a situation, you will enumerate all the events. In this document, it talks about Roswell, it talks about Aztec, and it says there's 7 others, or I guess 5 others, 7 total. Well, what are the others? Now, if I'm the guy receiving the document, that's my first question. And this documents like this are prepared for commanders and policymakers at the highest level. You need all that information. And I think once again they said, well, again, that's an attempt to cover themselves by saying, well, there's other events, but we're not going to enumerate them because we really don't know. And you can look at that. If you look at the whole history of UFO crashes, there are lists out there that incorporate some 300 or 400 different UFO crashes. And I'm thinking, if they're falling out of the sky with that regularity, we'd be having a whole lot of different conversations than we do now. I mean, they're just like falling out of the sky. I had said at one point, and when I did Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky, I thought there were 5 legitimate UFO crashes, the things that were fairly well documented. I was thinking of Roswell specifically, of course. I was thinking of Las Vegas in 1962. I was thinking of Kecksburg in 65. I was thinking of Shag Harbor. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking of the one that Jim Clarkson had been talking about in the Northwest. Since that book came out, I pretty well revised that, and I'm very worried about some of them. There's great documentation for Shag Harbor, for example, and the Canadians being involved, but nothing alien was recovered. Mm-hmm. Kecksburg is very problematic now to my way of thinking, especially with some of the information that's come out recently about it. I think Las Vegas is the same way. I think Las Vegas was a combination of 2 events that were timed very close together. They were some 15, 16 minutes apart, and made it look like there was a big, long event, but there's really 2 separate events. Roswell, if you want to look at it dispassionately, and that's what I did when I wrote Roswell in the 21st Century. I wanted to look at all the evidence dispassionately, but as it's a cold case, it's something that here is all this information, let's see where we can take it. And when you get down to it, we have very few documents. We have an FBI telex, for example. We have the Ramey memo, which is the document General Ramey is holding in his hand, which, when we start talking about provenance, here's a document with the perfect provenance. The guy's holding it in his hand. We know when the picture was taken. We know who took the picture. There's documentation showing that the picture was taken on July 8th, 1947. And we have General Ramey holding the document in his hand. We couldn't ask for a better provenance. We just can't read it.
Do you think there'll ever be, just to stop on that particular thought, do you think that technology will ever evolve enough to have that thing read, or do you think that's just out of the question?
There is a consensus among those who deal with this sort of thing that the technology may improve to the point where we can read it. And there's some interesting stuff being done in the attempts to read it. I know David Rudiak thinks he has deciphered the thing pretty much in attack. There are others who do not agree with all of his analysis, and what we need to do is come to a consensus, or come to a place where, another great example, the Roswell slides, where they had the placard, and they said it couldn't be read. Well, 2 days after the a high-quality scan, high-resolution scan was available to researchers, the placard was read. It was decoded. We could read it. We knew exactly what it said, and it was just that the technology was applied, and we were able to read it. So as our technology evolves, we may be able to read it, but we need to have a consensus, and that was the thing with the Roswell slides. There was pushback on that when we said it could be read. But the consensus was, and we said, I shouldn't say we, the Roswell Slides Research Group, and those people said, well, here's how we did it. Here's how we decoded it. Here's the steps you need to go through, and you'll get to the same answer we did. We've got to get to the point where we have a consensus. And with the Ramey memo, even given the work that David Rudiak has done, the Herculean effort he has put into deciphering this thing, the problem we have is we have no consensus of exactly what it says. There are a number of places where we can actually read words, like weather balloons, Fort Worth. Texas is spelled TXE for some reason. I don't know. It's not a proper abbreviation, and there may be something going on there that we don't understand. But for the most part, it's kind of there is no real consensus of what it says, and that's what we need. We need to have a consensus. And I can say to you, if you do this with your technology, you will read it. Well, you can find your own conclusions, and you'll probably see what we've seen. So with the Ramey memo right now, we're at the point where we're just on the fringe. And I think a couple of the people said, if the camera had been a foot closer, or Ramey had turned the document just slightly, we'd be able to read it perfectly. But that's what we're living with that. So the answer is, we may be able to get to a point where we have a consensus, although there will, like everything else in this field, there will be people who will disagree with us no matter what we offer in the way of proof.
Yes. Hey, in the chat, we do have some questions in the chat room, and we actually have the Shag Harbour Incident Society Interpretive is in the chat room right now. And you just mentioned Shag Harbour. I too agree that that's one of the actually one of the great cases out there. Actually going to be going up there to their convention, the 50th, this coming October, I think it is. I don't have anything here in front of me, but I'm going to be broadcasting live from that.
Well, you realize you'd have to go to Canada to see it.
Oh yes. No, I'll be out of Russia by then. I hope I'll be out of Russia.
I was making fun of Canada.
There's going to be some feedback.
But my show is hosted out of Hamilton, Ontario, Canada.
Oh, okay.
So
yeah.
So we blame Canada for everything.
Any technical difficulties, I'm sure that you blame that. In the chat room early on, someone asked, they wanted to know what your thoughts were about Stan Friedman's stance on this particular document.
I think it's evolved, hasn't it? He originally was really excited about it and was pushing it, and then 2 days later, Friday, he was on Midnight in the Desert. By the way, I got bumped from it, because they were overbooked, which makes no sense to me. But on that program, he seemed to take a more neutral stance. I think that because I was ready to pounce on that, because he's been a big advocate of Scott Ramsey's book and how well researched it is, and this MJ12 document is at odds with Ramsey's book. And so both of them can't be accurate and true. I suspect they're both false, but I was ready for that. But on the program, he seemed to have walked back from his initial excitement about it. And his initial excitement might have been simply he'd just seen the document and it looked good on a very cursory scan of it before he got a chance to sit down and really read it. And that was one of the reasons I was holding off, is I wanted a chance to read the document through to see if there were any glaring errors, and there's more red flags flying than there are in communist China. So we pretty well figured it was a fake, but I think Stan's walked it back from now, and I haven't heard anything from him since Friday. The other thing is it mentions Project Aquarius, and I know that Stan has really kind of ignored Project Aquarius. If you go back to Steinman's book, and there's another clue, there's the Aquarius document, which is supposedly the first MJ-12 document, but I think most everybody believes that Project Aquarius is that's faked, and it evolved from Project Aquarius into MJ-12, and so that gives you kind of the evolution. But the point is, he mentioned Project Aquarius. When I queried him about that, he mentioned, when I was doing my book Case MJ-12, I had queried him about Project Aquarius. And he said, I don't even mention it in my papers or in my book. And so I think he kind of ignored Project Aquarius, and now it's reared its ugly head again. So, but I think the answer is, I'm not real sure what his opinion is at this point, but he seems to have walked it back from his initial enthusiasm.
Yes. Just an update. I've talked to people on this show in the past, and there's no update actually. I'm in the fine arts and antiques business, and I was at an auction house where there was a estate of a retired CIA operative overseas who passed away several years ago. And in his footlocker, in his military footlocker, there were copies of the MJ-12 documents, but they were just the regular copies that have gone around and around, so nothing new at all. Well,
let me interrupt you here,
sure.
Because frankly, that's what I do, and it's your show, and I shouldn't do it. But not all that long ago, I got a call. A decade and a half ago or something, I got a call from a guy who was attending a gun show, and he says, "You got to get here right now. This guy's got some top secret documents about UFOs." So I rushed out to the gun show, paid my $2 to get in, and went over and looked at the MJ-12 documents.
Same ones.
Same ones.
Yeah, the same ones we've all seen. I think they were partially redacted, as the ones that Bill Moore initially released were.
Yeah.
So
my question was, why did this ex-CIA, retired CIA officer have them in the first place? But it could have, and I've never found out the answer to that. I was going to speak to his son, but he's not been available. So I don't think there's any answer. It's just maybe perhaps they were making the rounds because they thought they were humorous, or they had an interest in UFOs. There could be a lot of answers that really mean nothing.
Yes. And I've often, back when I was writing novels, we know that there's people who always read the last page of the book first.
Yes, that's me. I'm guilty.
So Bob Cohn and I were writing a book about the special forces in Vietnam, and we inserted something at the end of the book that you would think an event would take place in the book at some point, which never does. But when you get to the end of the book, that sentence makes sense to you. So you're expecting something and it never happens because the way we had constructed it. The other thing we did, we had a glossary of the Vietnam terms in there, and we put in the glossary horse, and then we put sea biscuit. Sea biscuit was a horse,
right? A racehorse.
But it's SEE biscuit, sea biscuit, and then you go up to biscuit, and there was some nonsensical explanation for what it was, which wasn't used in Vietnam, but we just wanted to put that joke in the book: horse, sea biscuit, And nobody ever catches these things.
Yeah.
The other thing, I go off on one more tangent for you. Bob and I were doing a book on the Alamo, and we were a time travel book. And one of the characters' name was Tom Waters. And so I wrote the line, "Waters rushed uphill." And Bob says, "You can't do that." And I said, "Nobody is ever going to pick it up because it's the name of the character. It flows naturally. Waters rushed uphill." And I suspect other writers do the same thing, put these little nuggets in there that are amusing to them that the general public doesn't get. So
well,
I have no idea what the relevance was, but there you go.
Well, if you're posting on social media today, if you write anything other than what's in the picture, people won't even notice it. They notice the picture. I think it's to the point that there's just so much information flying all over the place that people don't even take time to read anything.
Well,
So
they don't. Not only that, they don't even take time to analyze it, because some of the things that you see are so diametrically opposed to the facts that you should say, well, this just can't possibly be true, and yet they accept it because they've read it somewhere. Because you can't put anything on the internet that isn't true.
hey, Kevin, I want to ask you off the bat: have you received like negative emails or people really upset that they're saying you're debunking this or anything like that?
On this particular thing, no. I think practically everybody's in agreement. Steve Bassett, I had him on my show Saturday, and I thought we were going to have a very nice discussion about this document, where he would be advocating its legitimacy, and I would be suggesting no, it's not true. And in the first 30 seconds, he says, "Well, that document's a fake," and I'm going, "Oh, great! Now what do I talk about? We're on the same page here, pal. We don't have any kind of dialogue." And I mean, he was very excited about it when he called me on the Wednesday, but by the time we got to Saturday, he'd pretty well realized that the thing was faked. So I've gotten nothing like that. I always try to hold the door on the defensive end of these things. I think we have to put up a great defense if we're going to look at UFOs. We have to be able to defend our positions, for one thing, but we also have to point out the things that are false. And too often, people are looking for us to validate their own belief structure, and that just doesn't help us at all. Somebody really wants to believe in any of the myriad sub parts of UFO research, and you suggest that this case is maybe fraudulent or that case is bad or something. No matter what evidence you present, there are people who are going to be annoyed about it. I had done something with this General Lufkin, the lawyer from South Carolina, who was one of the people said he'd chatted with Eisenhower about the UFO crashes or something, and he became a big source. And I discovered that Lufkin was a general in what was called the State Guard Association, which is sort of a civilian organization that in some states it's looked on as a civilian auxiliary to the National Guard or things like that. It really has no real status, but he was a brigadier general in that, and they kept saying that. And I pointed out that this really isn't legitimate. In fact, I joined the organization, became a major general in it just to prove I could do it. And I got a lot of blowback on that. People were really annoyed about it. But I'm thinking, if we're going to understand the phenomenon, if we're going to understand what's going on, we have to look at all the stuff. And I can't tell you the number of people that have claimed to be military veterans who were not, or claiming a lot higher rank or position than they actually had. Great example gets back to MJ-12, the original document, the Eisenhower briefing document. There's this paragraph on this crash on December 6, 1950, near El Indio Guerrero, in just across the border from Texas. And it's an outgrowth of a story told by this guy named Robert Willingham. And the story that we had is Willingham was a retired colonel from the United States Air Force. He'd been a fighter pilot. Nobody had ever bothered to check his military record until I did it 15 years ago. And it turned out that Willingham had been in the military for 13 months. He joined in December of 1945, which makes him technically a veteran of World War II, because the war didn't technically end until 1946. So he's technically a veteran of World War II. He never heard a shot fired in anger. He was in for 13 months. That's his military career. But he's telling everybody he was a fighter pilot and he was chasing these UFOs over Texas. First it was in 1948, then it was 1950, then it was the mid-1950s. And that sort of thing. And looking at that, the story he told, it isn't true. I mean, his military background is the 13 months. He was in the Civil Air Patrol, which is an Air Force auxiliary, civilians, and they perform a wonderful service by taking the burden of search and rescue off the active duty forces. In other words, if you're a Civil Air Patrol member and you have an airplane and there's what they used to call a red cap, which is a legitimate search, you're called up and you're given a grid and you go out and search this grid flying your airplane. So, and the government will pay for your cost of your fuel and things like that. So you get to fly your airplane for free, which is, a lot of people will say, well, that's a great deal. But you're not part of the Air Force. You're an auxiliary to the Air Force. You do not get retirement points for it. But Willingham tried to switch his Civil Air Patrol service into the Air Force Reserve and get a pension. In other words, he was trying to commit fraud, which doesn't make him look very good. He said that he'd gotten out of the active duty Air Force because he'd been injured and they wouldn't let him fly fighters anymore, but they let him fly fighters in the Air Force Reserve. I had a number of friends when I was still in the National Guard, and I was assigned to our state headquarters. And of course, and I hesitate to use the term given the way it goes, but it was a purple headquarters, which means it had Red Army and Blue Air Force. So it was a combined headquarters. So I had a lot of friends who were fighter pilots. So I asked one of them about it. He said, no, that's not true. He said the reason you would be disqualified from flying fighters is if the injuries had been such that the forces of ejection would injure you more, or you wouldn't be able to stand the forces of ejection. You could be transferred into flying transport airplanes or something else like that. So you continue flying in the Air Force. Your jobs would be limited, and you wouldn't move from the active service to the reserve because the same forces applied. Just something that he didn't know, but. So that kind of calls into question the whole Eisenhower briefing document, because you have this paragraph about this event that Willingham invented in 1968. I found the original quotes, in fact, in the old Skylook, which was the MUFON Journal's original incarnation. So, this to me was like the fatal flaw in the Eisenhower briefing document. Takes the whole thing down.
Right.
But the point is, here's a guy who claimed military service at a high level. He when we checked the military records, it didn't hold up. There were pictures of him in Air Force uniform, so one from the 1960s, and people said, well, how could we have a picture of him in an Air Force uniform as an Air Force officer if he wasn't in the Air Force? And I looked at the picture, and I said, that's a Civil Air Patrol uniform, pal. And the giveaway was on the collar, you could see the CAP, and the Civil Air Patrol wears a metal badge over the right pocket that said Civil Air Patrol Air Force Auxiliary or something like that, U.S. Air Force Auxiliary. And you could see it on the picture. So it wasn't it was an Air Force uniform, yes, but it was Civil Air Patrol. And then in the other pictures, he's got on the Civil Air Patrol ribbons. In the Civil Air Patrol, you can wear ribbons you earned in the military. In other words, all the ribbons I earned as an Army officer, I could wear on my Civil Air Patrol uniform, and they would take precedent above any ribbons I earned in the Civil Air Patrol. And in his uniform, in the pictures that I've seen, he's got both the Civil Air Patrol ribbons and some ribbons I don't think he earned, ribbons from the Air Force. So it's clearly a Civil Air Patrol uniform as opposed to an Air Force uniform. So I mean, but a lot of people would look at that and they didn't pick up on that. They saw him in the khaki uniform from the mid 1960s, what was called I think it was a 505 uniform, and they say, well, here's an Air Force uniform in the mid 1960s. How do you explain that? And the answer is, it's not an Air Force uniform, pal. It's Civil Air Patrol. Yeah.
Well, back in I think about 2 or 3 years ago, I had Bill Burns was on the show, and we were talking about the Kiami, I'm trying to remember what it's called, Kiami, Mexico crash,
Yes.
collision, when the small airplane, collides supposedly with a UFO.
Yes.
And the military got involved. Well, that was 1974. And I had someone who was listening live at the time wrote me during the show in the chat room and said that they were actually one of the military people on the U.S. that was there on site. Well, I looked into the guy's record as much as I could, and yes, it did show that he was in. I think he was in perhaps the Army or something like that, and this was all through social media that I was looking. And then I saw his birth date, 1965. So I wrote him, nice try. You can't be 9 years old and be doing that. So I'm sure there are, I mean, just with my short experience, there must be a lot of people that are, trying to get some type of glory out of certain, situations like you just mentioned.
Well, there's something called stolen valor, which is people wearing military awards and decorations they did not earn, wearing military uniforms that they are not authorized to wear, and things like that. And you can check those. I was reading an obituary from a guy in the paper, and it said he was a Vietnam veteran. And I looked at his birth date, and he was born in 1957. And I'm thinking, no, you were not a Vietnam veteran. Our forces were pretty much out of Vietnam by 72. But we did have some specialized forces, and I say specialized as opposed to special forces, in Vietnam till April of 1975. But none of those people would have been 18 years old.
Yeah, you'd have to be born in 1955 or before to be in Vietnam.
Yeah, pretty much. And so it, just all little things like that. And I'm thinking, do I write the newspaper and say, well, this guy's a lying sack of... But the guy's dead, and his family's not going to be happy with that. Yeah. So the other thing is, I was reading the paper and it talked about this guy from this poor soul who had been on the Titanic, managed to survive that, and had been on the Lusitania, and it gave all these details. And I finally wrote and I've got a book here. This lists all the survivors off the Titanic, and his name was not among them.
Wow.
So I mean. And now in today's world, you could go on the internet and you can type in, Titanic survivors and get the whole list of names. But he wasn't among it. So this guy had been running around in the 1930s claiming that. Or the other one that I always cite is, at one point at the turn of the century, and by that I mean the last century, from 1899 to 1900, there were carnivals all over the country, and 15 guys claiming to be the real Jesse James. Well, 14 of them had to be lying.
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit, bringing the UFO topic back into it. It's a little bit like UFO, like Rendlesham Forest. There's questions, going back and forth about Larry Warren, whether he was actually there when he actually. There's, I don't know. We don't have to get into that at all. But I mean, supposedly there's a letter written to his mother that says he's talking about his roommate that was actually there. So. I know there's controversy, and I know when something major like that happens, there's a lot of people that want to, when they know enough information about it, they want to get some of the glory from it. I guess that's what it all boils down to.
There's absolutely no question that Larry Warren was serving at the base there in December of 1980. I have seen videotape. Russ Estes had interviewed Warren at length. And Warren was saying when the event took place, he was on leave in Germany. Charles Halt said no, when the third night took place, Warren was actually drunk in the barracks and was not a part of the activities there. But Warren was there and heard his colleagues. Warren had been in the Air Force for 8 months or something like that when he was assigned there. So he didn't have a very lengthy military career. There's no question he was assigned to the base. The real question is, did he participate in the events, or did he just hear his colleagues talking about it? I suspect he just heard his colleagues talk about it. I know Halt is just livid with Larry Warren, and I think over the top livid on that. But I mean, there's another example. The guy was at least there. He may not have been a participant in the events, but he was at least there. And I say that sometimes about people in Vietnam who claim they were in Vietnam. At least they were there, even though they were in a fairly safe. Pat Sajak from Wheel of Fortune was in Vietnam. I spent the longest time when we would go out to pre-flight the aircraft before the missions. The automatic direction finder covers the broadcast radio band, so we could listen to the radio. And so we would listen to the radio as we were checking in with operations and all that, and we'd hear Pat Sajak. He was Army PFC Pat Sajak. I always thought it was a tape that they had flown over from the States for him, but actually I guess he was in Saigon doing his radio show.
Like
so there's a guy.
Robin Williams, Good Morning Vietnam, right?
Well, Robin Williams wasn't in there.
I know. I'm just saying, like the movie. He was a radio announcer.
Yes, and they were in Saigon doing the Armed Forces Radio, AFVN, and here's one more war story. And I don't mean to do this, but we would always listen to the radio while we're flying the missions. You got the ADF going in the background, listen like when you're driving your car. Had all the other radios going too, and if there was a good song on the radio, somebody would just key the mic and say ADF, which means you needed to turn on your ADF if you weren't listening to it so you could hear the good tune. So we're going into a high old Z. We're taking fire, and in the middle of all this shooting, somebody says ADF. And what it was Arthur Brown, the crazy world of Arthur Brown, and he was singing Fire.
Good timing. Wow.
So, yeah, that's what I thought. So anyway, but I digress, and I don't mean to. The point simply is, I think, too often people do not check the backgrounds of those claiming military service, and we end up with these guys making claims about high-ranking officers saying this, that, or the other thing, and it turns out that they weren't in a position to know. They weren't they did not hold the positions they claimed, and they did not hold the ranks they claimed, and that kind of undercuts any credibility they would have.
Back to the document, who do you think would, someone obviously spent hours and hours and hours of time putting this together. Do you think it had any type of link with the original, MJ-12 documents, or do you think this is someone that did this recently on their own?
I think there's somebody did it recently on their own. It's not disinformation. And there's another interesting thing. When I was talking to Steve Bassett about it, beginning, the first time he said, well, there's 3 or 4 different things. It's disinformation. It's somebody put it together themselves or something like that. When he and I talked on Saturday, he was of the opinion it was not disinformation. It was just somebody had put it together. I agree with that. I had come to that assessment as well, that somebody just put it together. It's a recent document put together for the amusement of whoever did it. I don't know if he or she thought they could float this into the UFO community and then a week or two later say, haha, gotcha, you dumbasses, you couldn't tell the fakes from the real, and the consensus seems to be it's faked. Or somebody looking to kind of promote the 70th anniversary of the Roswell case by throwing this out. But I think it came from the civilian world, if you will. Somebody put it together, had a limited knowledge of the UFO materials, had a limited knowledge of how classifications work, and had, I would bet money on it, used as a template for some of this information, UFO Crash at Aztec.
Yes.
By William Steinman.
Okay, so just to let the live listener know, in the chat room, I have not forgotten you, and I will get to your questions, and feel free to keep posting them on there. So this document, I think I wrote you in an email the other day that when it comes to the conversation, the interview with the EBE that supposedly survived from the Aztec crash, it did the lingo. You mentioned the English that was used and all that, and yes, I agree. Also, the content of what the EBE was supposedly saying, it just didn't make sense to me that that's how, and I don't even know how an extraterrestrial would talk. Would they come down to our level to try to speak to us in a way that we'd understand and all that? So I have no idea, but do you think there was any creativity in that part at all, or do you think it was just kind of like how I feel? I just feel like an ET wouldn't say those type of things.
Well, apropos of nothing at all, I noticed that Klaatu talked to us pretty much as an intelligent individual. Yes, Klaatu was the Michael Rennie character in The Day the Earth Stood Still. Klaatu Borata Nikto for all of you people out there. No, it was just stupid. You've got supposedly multiple interviewers talking to this alien creature, however they're communicating it, and they're not saying, well, where's your home world? Mm-hmm. What star do you come from? No, we're saying, well, we came here because we like the trees. Yeah. And I'm up for trees. I mean, trees are cool. I like trees. I'm not sure I'm going to be flying to other planets and other solar systems to see their trees, unless they're really exotic. But I mean, no, it just didn't make any sense at all.
What
It's
about the
just,
children part of it too, right?
well, we always must think of the children.
Yeah.
I remember the Simpsons episode where they're doing that. And they're, what about the children? And the guy jumps out the window because the children are going to be somehow hurt. And I mean, it's just it doesn't make any sense. It's just absolutely ludicrous. It's sort of put together as a stream of consciousness as opposed to something with a lot of thought put into it. If I'm interviewing an alien creature, I'm wanting to know where they're coming from. I'm wanting to know their mission. I'm wanting to know how they defeat the distances, the interstellar distances. I'm wanting to know what source of energy they use. All of these things are very difficult to invent, to make up for this. Although I think I'd say they came from the Tau Ceti system, but I don't know why. It's a kind of a cool star. Oh, Aldebaran is cool. Anyway, something like that. But it's just stuff that's really easy to make up. It doesn't take any thought, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And so the interview was, if I had been creating the document and I'd run it by a pal, he'd have probably said, lose the interview, because that really sends up a red flare. Let's say a red flare on a hot air balloon, on a weather balloon, a red flare on a weather balloon for people to see. No, it's just absolutely ludicrous.
Did you watch the movie Arrival that came out last year?
I did.
And now they asked the questions that you would want to ask, I think. And I'm surprised they didn't kind of use that as a little bit of a template.
I think the person that did this wasn't smart enough to go see that movie. Because it took a little bit of a cerebral activity to sit there and understand what was going on, because there were no explosions. Things weren't blowing up. Things weren't falling out of the sky and that sort of thing. It was a very cerebral activity going on there, as opposed to Independence Day resurgence, which makes no sense at all, but let's blow some stuff up.
Yes, I couldn't get through that. I was surprised. I just tried to watch that recently. Yeah.
It was just absolutely horrid.
Yeah. It was a disappointment.
I liked it. I liked Independence Day. I mean, that was okay, but
but
they blew a lot of stuff up on that, and there were things that didn't make any sense militarily speaking. My favorite line in Independence Day was, "Is this glass bulletproof?"
Is the what bulletproof?
With the aliens. Is this glass bulletproof? They're standing down there, and Brent Spinner's being choked by the alien, and the president's having trouble with it going on, and the one guy says, "Is this glass bulletproof?" And they say no, and they all haul out their weapons and start shooting. Which, by the way, would never happen, because here's a little tidbit for you. When we were in Iraq, they built a big fancy dining facility, because they don't have mess halls anymore. Big fancy dining facility, and we would go there for lunch or something, but we were told on one day we couldn't bring our weapons. Normally we went everywhere with our weapons, but on one day we couldn't bring our weapons, and the reason was President Bush had showed up to serve turkey to the troops, and they didn't want 2,000 armed people marching through the dining facility. I mean, we were all armed and we all had ammunition, and they were told to leave their weapons home, which was a key that something interesting was going on, because we would have overwhelmed the Secret Service if we had decided to do that. Which is not advocating anything. I'm just merely commenting on why they didn't want us to bring our weapons. But we knew something unusual was going on. But so the point is, when you get the president, people are disarmed. They don't run around with all their weapons, even in a combat environment, which we were in.
Wow. I never would have thought of that. Someone posted a question on the forum, so let me just throw this one at you. Some have, this was by, let's see, who brought this in? Bill wrote this, and it's a long question. It's a two-part question, so hang in there. This may take
my God, 2 parts.
This may take the rest of the show. Some have claimed that the government engages in a form of soft disclosure or an inclination program where the entertainment industry is used to prepare the public for the truth about the UFO phenomena. Various sci-fi movies and TV programs have been cited as examples, and some have pointed to specific individuals influencing the show content with links to the government agencies. What are your thoughts about that? I'll get to the other part of this after you answer that part.
Oh, which movies are the soft disclosure? Independence Day, where they've invaded.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no.
I mean, you can look at The Day the Earth Stood Still, which that would be soft disclosure, where Klaatu is able to stop the electricity for 30 minutes, to showing the power that they have, and even the exceptions were extraordinary according to the script. But on the other hand, you look at how many invasion movies have there been, and the Independence Day springs to mind immediately, where the world is being destroyed by the aliens, or V, where we've got sort of the aliens are here and they're supposedly benevolent, but we have the resistance going on because they're not benevolent. So you can look at all of that stuff. So I think it's just the mood of Hollywood at the time when they make the movie. I think it has nothing to do with soft disclosure or anything else. It's just they're putting together a story that they find interesting at that time, for whatever reason. There is no motivation for the government to disclose anything they have at this point. Disclosure will come when the aliens land and make their presence known. That's when disclosure will happen. And I know Steve Bassett will yell at me for this.
I was just going to ask you about that.
But that is my feeling, that there is absolutely no motivation to disclose anything at this point. So the idea that they're trying to get us used to the idea of alien visitation through these programs, I just don't buy into. Well, I guess that pretty well covers it.
Yes, but it actually covers the second part of the question too, because he was asking, do you think these fake briefing documents that mix fact with fiction and disinformation per se was a type of soft disclosure? But I think you just basically covered that. And I agree with you. I don't think there's any motivation, and they would have way too much explaining to do if they came forward and actually said something was going on.
And let's look at it from another point of view. I mean, we have, in the last 50 years or so, we have learned that the U.S. government has participated in some really disgusting things. I think of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where they either injected the black men with syphilis, or the black men came for treatment for syphilis and they were not treated, so they could map the course of the disease. They could see how it progressed over the years. It's a disgusting thing to have done. There was another experiment where they were exposing children and adults who were either very ill or had grave diseases that couldn't be cured or things like that, to radiation, so they could see what the progress of radiation sickness and how to combat that. I mean, those are disgusting things.
Yes. And
as American citizens, we should be horrified that this was even thought to be legitimate areas of research. So I cannot think of anything that they would have learned from a crashed UFO that they wouldn't have felt comfortable disclosing by this point. So that kind of, you look at that and you think, well, if they're not going to disclose it, there's not going to be a hint about it. There's just not going to be any documentation. There's not going to be any place to go with it. So this idea that there would be disclosure, I think the closest we ever came was in the mid-1990s when Stan was doing his book on Roswell, and I was working with Don Schmidt on our books in Roswell, and there was a lot of discussion about that. And we're coming up on the 50th anniversary, and the Air Force got in and did their investigation of the Roswell case. I think that was the closest we ever came, because I think we had them worried at that point that something was going to leak, and they were able to shut it down with their nonsensical Project Mogul. Was
there a senator or someone involved in that? Pardon me for interrupting.
I I think it was a congressman, Stephen
Congressman.
Schiff, from
Okay, right.
from New Mexico, who just queried the Air Force. But you go back, and there have been other queries to the Air Force, especially about Project Moondust. And I know that Jeff Bingaman, who was a senator from New Mexico, had queried the Air Force about Project Moondust. And he got a response from the Air Force, the Congressional Liaison Office, saying there's no such project as Moondust. When the documents that had been inadvertently leaked into the public, I think Robert Todd got them originally in one of his FOIA requests to the State Department and found the Project Moondust documents in there. And the Cliff Stone FOIA'd it and got some documents, and then I FOIA'd and got some documents. But we had all these documents from the State Department, from a provenance. You could say the State Department sent us this stuff, referencing Project Moondust. I later found 4 cases in the Project Blue Book files labeled Project Moondust, so clearly it existed. Anyhow, the documents were sent to the Air Force, and the Air Force said, we'd like to amend our last statement. There was a Project Moondust, we just never used it. Well, that was another lie too, because we had instances where it had been deployed. So, even when you get close to something, you have the documents in hand, they're going to lie to you about it. So I think disclosure is in the hands of the alien creatures. If they want to disclose themselves, they're going to do it. And I don't think of any motivation the government has to tell us anything that they know.
All right. Well, along these lines, what segment or what part of the government do you think could possibly be being involved in the cover-up of when something like this happens, or when you hear about a jet, chasing a UFO or something like that? They have to be, someone knows about it. And you've been in the military. Do you think that there's like one special segment that gets carried on generationally somehow, that knows actually that there is something going on? I don't think they know what is going on, but something going on.
I believe that after the Roswell case, the government kind of changed its tune and tried to decipher what exactly they had found there and understand it. And that may have been a large project back then, but as the years passed and they were unable to manipulate the data, they're unable to understand what was going on, the number of people involved continued to shrink until it's a very minute number. And I think it's one of these things look at J. Edgar Hoover. He was the director of the FBI for decades. And I think it's that sort of thing. You've got a small department there of a number of people, and the people in it are very select, and they have access to a lot of the good stuff, and that they are holding on it. So when something like that happens, they can manipulate things, and it's compartmentalized as well, so that there are very few people that know the whole picture, but there may be some people who know part of the picture, a very small part of the picture. Mm-hmm. And so it all kind of works that way. So,
and what do you think about this particular? Let's say there is a compartmentalized section that has this information. Do you think there's communications with other similar, I don't want to say organizations, but groups in different countries, or do you think this is kept country per country?
I would think that, and here I'm going to sound awful American-centric. I think the United States government has the answers, and other governments maybe suspect but don't have the answers. When I did the UFO dossier, I just love the way you lead me into being able to promote books. I was looking at the Australian government's UFO research, which was very interesting. And there was one fellow who was advocating an Australian government UFO project and that sort of thing. And so they asked the Australian Air Force about it. And I think that one of the sources he said it was one of Don Kehoe's books. And so they asked the Australian Air Force about it, who asked the U.S. Air Force about it. And the U.S. Air Force says, you can't believe anything Don Kehoe says. He's just a liar out there trying to make a buck. And so I went back to the Australians. There's nothing for us to really look at. We don't need to waste the money and spend the time. So the U.S. government, the U.S. Air Force, was kind of manipulating the situation, because we find out that Kehoe was right more often than he was wrong. But the point really is, the Australian Air Force went to their colleagues in the American Air Force, and the American Air Force guys said, "Nah, it's nothing to it." And I think there's another point here too, that the guys. There may be some guys at the very top who know about it, but if I do not believe there's anything to UFOs, and I'm some colonel or brigadier general sitting in the Pentagon, and my colleague from Australia calls me and says, "What do you think about this stuff?" And especially this Kehoe guy, and I say, "I don't think much about him. I think he's kind of a creep," and let it go at that. I haven't lied to them. I haven't misdirected them. I'm telling them what I know. I just don't have a clear picture. And so there's always that part. If I tell you a lie, and you believe it, and you repeat that lie, you're not lying. You're telling what you believe to be the truth. It's the initial information was inaccurate. So we've got to look at all that. I believe that if there was a crash at Roswell and there was a organization created to investigate it, that organization is still alive today, and the mantle of secrecy is kind of passed down from generation to generation that way. And I think the number of people involved in the very core of this organization, the ones who know all the really good stuff, is a very finite number, a very small number of people who are working actively to keep the information hidden. But the other side of the coin is we're doing it to ourselves. We just had another fine example of this MJ-12 document. You said it went viral in the UFO community. I think it may have gone a little bit more viral into a larger audience, but in the end, it's going to say, "Well, it's just another hoax from the UFO. Yeah, all that MJ-12 stuff, that's all a crap. It's like this whole UFO thing." And if I'm one of the operatives, and they say, "Yeah, I created that document. Look at what it's done for us," even though it hasn't done it, I just take credit for it, because it completes our mission. We're doing it to ourselves, especially when we keep advocating things that we may know in our heart of hearts aren't true. It's when I say I want to hold the door against all of this stuff. I want to keep the truth out there. I want to keep going for the truth and not having to embrace the indefensible to get my voice heard. And so I take a lot of flack for that. When people will say to me, "What do you think about such and such a case?" And if I gave my opinion, then they get mad at me. Even though the facts are on my side, they get mad at me, because what they want me to do is validate their personal belief structure, and I'm not going to do that. There are a lot of people out there who will do that, who will embrace everything to keep the invitations coming to the conferences and that sort of thing.
Yes.
So you've got to take a look at all of that information, and you've got to sit there and look at it very dispassionately. And by that I mean you look at it coldly, assume it's untrue, and look at it from that point of view and see what we can do to reverse that opinion.
I hate to say it, but it's kind of like my being in the art business, that I'm an appraiser, and I always say that a really nice painting by a really good artist is guilty until proven innocent, because I have to prove that's the authorship of that artist, so it's kind of along that same way. You just have to look at it very logically and very carefully. Now, Chris, I was really very fortunate, and one of the only few to get he was a government DOD insider, Chris Mellon, from the Mellon Bank family. He was on the show months ago, actually about a year ago, and I asked him the question. I said, if the president wants to know everything the government knows about UFOs, could the president find out? And he said, absolutely. Now, do you think that? And
I will second that. I've always said that the president can find out whatever the hell he wants.
Yeah, but do you think that that information could be protected in a type of way where a president couldn't find out? And in other words, maybe in the private sector somehow, or how would they protect that information from a president? I should say.
First of all, the president has got to have a motivation to ask for it.
Yes.
And if he has no motivation to ask for it, they're not going to volunteer the information. There's an awful lot of stuff the president has to know to operate day to day. That has nothing to do with UFOs. UFOs is pretty esoteric and sort of one of those nice to know things. But if you're the president, you've got, especially in today's environment, you've got an awful lot on your plate that you've got to be dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and UFOs just doesn't have a place there. The second point is you have to ask the right person the right question. And if you go to the wrong person and say, well, what can you tell me about UFOs? And the guy says, I know nothing about it. We have no files. There's nothing there. It's all a bunch of hooey. And that's what the guy knows, and he's telling the president the truth. There's nowhere else to go. You've got to find the right person and ask the right questions. And sometimes asking the right question is important. Back in the olden days when Carl Flock was still around, he was investigating the Roswell case and looking in whether or not the Roswell Fire Department had a role in going out to the crash site. And he talked to a fireman in the fire department and was chatting with him about that. And the guy was saying, no, we didn't make a run out there, and we didn't do this, and we didn't do that. And Carl Flock reports that in his book, Roswell: Inconvenient Facts and the Will to Believe. I talked to the fireman after Carl did, and he was telling me exactly what he told Carl. And then I asked him one other question. I said, do you know Dan Dwyer? He said, yeah, I know Dan. Dan went out there. I said, what? He said, oh, yeah, we had this colonel come by, and it's always a colonel. It's never a captain, never a major. It's always a colonel. Come by the fire department, and he said, we've got this covered. Don't worry about it, so you don't have to do anything else. But Dan got in his private car and went out there. Well, this suddenly explained all the inconsistencies we had, because I could find nothing in the fire records about a run outside of the city limits by the fire department. Well, they didn't make one. But how did Dan Dwyer know about it? Well, he went out there in his private car and took a look around. So, but Carl hadn't asked the next question. If I'd said, once the guy had told me there was nothing to it, we didn't go out there, we didn't make a run out there, I don't really know anything about it, that would have been the end of it. But I said, do you know Dan Dwyer? And his answer kind of stunned me when he said, oh yeah, he went out. And it became that he went out as a private citizen in his private car. Carl got the information he wanted and didn't ask the next question. And I've had that happen to me a couple of times where I was doing research back in the olden days. I would visit morgues of newspapers, and I'd go back to the 1897 newspapers and look for stories about the airship. And I found one in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, about how the thing had landed on the Union Station, and a number of the local citizens had taken a ride in it. And no, I'm sorry, that was a hoax. But in the paper there was one it had crashed in Waterloo, Iowa, and there was a story in the newspaper about the crash in the Waterloo, Iowa area. And it was really an interesting story. And I thought, great. And I copied that, and I came home. And then I thought, maybe I should have looked at the next day's paper. And I went back to the next day's paper, and it said, yeah, they had found out it was a hoax that had been built by a couple of guys in Waterloo, and they had fun on that. And when I'd done a number of books, I would mention that story, and I have a picture that had been a drawing, an illustration from the Cedar Rapids Gazette in it. And when I did the government UFO files, I was recounting this story about this crash. And lo and behold, the editor found an actual photograph of the thing. I couldn't believe it. I'm living in Iowa. This guy is in New York, and he finds a photograph of the Waterloo hoax, if you will. But I mean, the point simply is, I went back the next day and got the rest of the story. And sometimes you have to ask the next question and the next question to get to where you want to go.
That is a really good point on how things can get, how things can grow without, if you didn't go back and check. Go ahead.
But it's also a point. It's also a point on how you get the information you want and you quit.
Right.
Sometimes I got this wonderful story of the airship crashing in Waterloo, Iowa, and I'm really happy about it. But the next day, it's all explained. And that's the real thing. You have to ask the next question. You have to follow all the leads to make sure you get to where you want to go.
Right. And I do want to, since we're on the subject of hoaxes, I do want to talk about the Aztec supposed crash. But before that, there was a question up on the message board. Carrie, I think it was, wanted to know what you thought about Bob Bigelow's recent statement that UFOs are here and ETs are here in the recently released 60 Minutes interview with him.
We have any number of people who are wealthy, who are highly educated, who are well connected, who are in the government, who have said things like that repeatedly. We can point to astronauts. We can point to former presidents. We can point to General MacArthur said that he thought the next big war would be between Earth and an alien invader. So we have all of that. Unfortunately, that does not constitute proof. Mm-hmm. And I got hung up in a debate with Steve Bassett about this. I said, what's the best UFO case? And he went off on a tangent with me. And what I should have said when he got done with his tangent is you're telling me that, I've got to do this research to, disprove all of this stuff. And I'm thinking, no, what really has to happen is you have got to prove to me that we have alien visitation. Just making the statement isn't sufficient. You have got to have the proof to back it up, and proof that we can all look at and come to a consensus about. And that's how science works. I say, I've created cold fusion. And all the scientists says, nah, you haven't. And I say, this is the way I did it. And they all go out to their laboratories and says, nah, that did not work. And so you realize that the first evidence of the cold fusion is a hoax. If I say, I've invented cold fusion, and you say, nah, you haven't, and I say, this is how I did it, and you guys go to the laboratory and you do the same thing, then we have a consensus that says, yes, cold fusion works, and this is how it does. And that's the problem we have with UFOs. We have people making these statements. I have no doubt that Bob Bigelow believes that. I've met Bob Bigelow. I've been to his office. He and I went out to Area 51 back 20 years ago. We had KFC and stopped at a picnic area and ate KFC as we went out there. We didn't see anything exciting, but we went out and took a look around. So the fact that he truly believes that is great, but he didn't offer any evidence that it was true.
Yeah. I think, I personally think it was good that he actually said it, because, if someone of his stature will say something like that, perhaps more people will look into it. I mean, instead of it just being such a fringe topic. And I'm really glad that he doesn't care. He doesn't care what people think about it. And and I love the fact that he has that little alien on the side of his building.
Well, I interviewed James Van Allen, the radiation belt guy.
Oh yes.
I had a chance to sit down with him and chat with. Well, he was at the University of Iowa. He was the head of the Department of Physics and Astronomy. And my friend Bob Cornett, I'd mentioned earlier, said that we should interview him, because I know him. And I'm thinking, yeah, Bob, you know Van Allen. Right. So we're on an elevator in the physics building, and Van Allen gets on the elevator, and Van Allen looks at Bob and says, "Hi, Bob." Was
he wearing a belt?
Yes, and that is, in fact, the only Van Allen belts he will talk about. In the University of Iowa, they're the radiation belts. The Van Allen belt holds up his pants, but he gets on the elevator. He says, "Hi, Bob," and Bob says, "Hi, Van, how you doing?" So it turned out he really did know Van Allen, and we sat down with the interview, and we talked about specifically about UFOs. And he was very open, and I said, "Do you have any problems with talking about this?" And he says, "No, I mean, it's Van Allen, for God's sakes. Nobody's going to really say bad things about him." And the one thing he said that really kind of cracked me up, only it was decades later, was he said, if you're in the middle of Wyoming and you hear the thunder of hoofbeats, you don't expect zebra. Mm-hmm. Meaning that you've got to look at the most likely answers before you get into the exotic. And then what it was a year and a half ago, I heard this story about this zebra who escaped in Wyoming, was running around loose in Wyoming. And I'm thinking, oh my God, you're hearing the thunder of hoofbeats in Wyoming, and it is a zebra. But the point simply is, Van Allen didn't worry about his reputation being sullied by talking about UFOs. Bigelow doesn't have to worry about his. On the other hand, there's too many in the news media. And I fear that most of the news media is fake news now, giving everything that I've been saying lately about everything. They don't want to ruin their reputations by seriously investigating UFOs or looking at a UFO story seriously. Don and I had an interview at the Chicago Tribune when our first book came out. And so we get to the Tribune for that, and this girl meets us in the hallway. And she was an intern, And we said, well, we're going to go inside. She said, no, I'll talk to you out here. So they wouldn't even let us into the city room to sit down at a desk. She interviewed us. The intern interviewed us about UFOs, because clearly there's no such thing as alien visitation, and everybody who is very sophisticated knows that, and we're not going to demean ourselves by talking to you guys because you might actually have some proof that proves that we were wrong. But I mean, we've run into that an awful lot of times. You don't get the top reporters talking about UFOs in any kind of serious vein. When there's a story that comes out, it's always treated tongue-in-cheek. And the one that really cracked me up was when those guys in New Jersey were launching the hot air balloon, the weather balloons with flares on them, to prove how credulous UFO investigators were and how poor witnesses were. And it turned out the witnesses were describing exactly what they'd seen, and the investigators were saying, "Well, yeah, it sounds like either a Chinese lantern or a weather balloon with a flare on it."
Good.
And the news reporters are down there talking to this little girl with her lollipop and says, "What do you think about aliens?" Nobody had said a word about aliens until the reporter introduced it, talking to some little kid. And I'm thinking, there you go. That shows you the level of sophistication in the newsroom. We'll go out and we'll do the story on the flying saucers, the UFOs, and we'll talk to some little kid and ask them what they think about the aliens, even though nobody had really drawn the conclusion about the lights being alien spacecraft until the reporters had done it, and the guys who were conducting the experiment introduced that into the conversation as well, which at that point sort of negated any results they got, because they were interfering with the experiment. So
yeah,
but I mean, it just kind of proves the whole media aspect of it.
Right. And next week on Wednesday, I'll have Philip Mantle. I'm going to be doing some shows with some European guests because of the time slot I'm in, and he'll be on, and we're going to be talking about the British tabloids who have really exploited the UFO topic. I'm sure you've noticed, Kevin, over the last few years. That's going to be one of our big topics. I just want to read you some kind words someone wrote here in the chat room. He's, meaning you, the only researcher most of us trust to be thorough and objective. Thank you very much to Mr. Willis and Mr. Randle. So I just thought I'd read that to you.
Thank you, whoever you are.
Yeah,
I appreciate it. Because it's usually you're a debunker.
Yes.
You lying debunker.
I'm sure you do get that.
My favorite was somebody accused me of being having worked with Hector Quintanilla on Project Blue Book. You know, when I don't think so, pal, but you know, there you go.
Yeah. Here's another question, Kevin. What do you think about? What do you think of Major General McCaslin, retired, telling Tom DeLonge that the Air Force discovered a life form in the early years of the Cold War, and that there have been multiple crash retrievals, some outside of the U.S.? I'm not familiar with that exactly, but I've heard McCaslin's name before.
I've heard the same thing, and I just can't buy it, because once again, if you've got multiple crashes, every time one crashes, in 1947, the thing that if it fell at Roswell, that was like an ideal place for it to crash, because the military could control the media, and it was very hard to get to the location. It was literally hours away from anywhere. If one crashed in, say, downtown, I'll say Denver, just for laughs, down there, maybe in Larimer Square, crashed down there, there's no way to hide it. There's no way to cover it up. If one crashes in the woods in northern Canada, way up in the Yukon area, then the government might be able to cover it up. But if you've got an awful lot of crashes going on and a lot of people involved in it, that information is going to be out in a much more robust form than we have it today. So I think there's probably not multiple crashes. I do not know why a major general would consult with. Is that the guy from Blink 182?
Right. Yeah.
I almost said Red Hot Chili Peppers. Sorry,
Red
Hot
Blink
Chili
181. I don't even know. Sorry.
Or maybe it's
Turk
182. I'm sorry.
No, I think you got it right. Yeah.
But I'm not sure why a major general would confide in somebody like that. Which is not to say there's anything wrong with him. I mean, it's just, a major general and Blink 182 just are kind of like oil and water. They really don't mix. type thing. So I don't understand that, so I'm very leery about that. And we've got an awful lot of these stories where high-ranking officials supposedly confided in someone else, but we are unable to confirm the information through the original source. We've got it from a secondhand source.
Yes. So let's talk about Aztec, because a number of who's the couple that wrote the book? There was a husband and wife.
Scott and Suzanne Ramsey.
Yes, they were going to be on my show at one point, and then I think I read a blog on your website, and I canceled the show. I'm not joking. That was back years ago. I think at least 3 years ago.
I can do better than that. I invited Scott Ramsey on my show, and he said no, he wasn't going to do it. Why should he support my show? And I'm thinking, I don't need you to support my show. My show's doing really fine without you. So, don't take the opportunity to promote your book on my show. I don't care. And he said, why don't you get Monty Shriver on it? I said, okay. So I did. Monty Shriver, of course, is the exact opposite. He said there's nothing there and that the crash is a hoax. So I had Monty Shriver explaining why he believed it to be a hoax, and Scott Ramsey was unable to offer the rebuttal because he didn't want to appear on the program.
Can you tell a quick nutshell of what had supposed to have happened? And then I want you to kind of go over why you think it's a hoax. I'm stumbling around here figuring out how to start. Well, the story is that on March 25th, 1948, something fell outside of Aztec, New Mexico at Hart Canyon. A number of civilians were there and saw it. The government showed up. The military showed up. They surrounded the craft. They couldn't find any seams, couldn't find anything about it, but there was a porthole with a hole in it, and they poked a rod through it, and by poking the pole around in there, they hit a switch and opened the whole thing up. And then they found, originally, I think they found 16 little bodies, about 38 to 42 inches tall, dressed in 1890 garb. I don't know why they'd be dressed in 1890 garb, and that they were from Venus. Well, of course, we know Venus is probably not the likely point of origin today. But the original story was they were dressed in this 1890, and they had perfect teeth, by the way. They had perfect teeth. The story came out in a book called Behind the Flying Saucers by Frank Scully. He got the story from two men. The traveling salesman or something?
No, Silas Newton and Leo G. Bauer. Newton turns out to be really kind of an interesting guy. He was a top-ranked amateur golfer. He'd studied at Yale, had apparently made a couple of fortunes, but he was also a con man. And I think if there were two ways of doing something, the right way and the wrong way, he'd pick the wrong way because it would be more fun. But he fed this story to Frank Scully. The idea was that he and Gebauer had created some kind of device, what they called a doodle bug, and this was supposed to be able to find oil deposits far beneath the surface of the Earth. And they were trying to get investors to invest in their doodle bug. And they eventually got sued or arrested for fraud, and I guess were convicted of fraud, which I think kind of undercuts the validity of the story. So a fellow named J.P. Kane for the San Francisco Chronicle, although there's some question of whether he worked for the Chronicle or was more of a stringer for the Chronicle, but he did a story for the San Francisco Chronicle that appeared in True Magazine in, I think, 1952 about this and about his whole investigation and what he had learned about this thing. And the conclusion was it was a hoax, and I think pretty much the UFO community sided with Kane on this thing, and you couldn't really talk to anybody about UFO crashes because of this hoax. Len Stringfield turned all of that around with his research. But so everybody kind of ignored the Aztec case because there wasn't any documentation. There were no newspaper articles. All you had was this tale told by Behind the Flying Saucers. As the FBI began to release some of their documents later on, you could find hints about the story, but it all is traceable back to the book Behind the Flying Saucers. So it wasn't that they were getting other sources and documenting the case from other places. They were actually talking about the book Behind the Flying Saucers and what the information was in there. And then you had William Steinman, do the book UFO Crash at Aztec in the mid-1980s. His co-author was Wendell Stevens. But Wendell Stevens has a very unsavory background. He spent 6 years in jail for child molestation. So I'm not sure that anything Wendell Stevens tells me I want to hear, regardless of the topic. But he did a book which was much thicker, but it was loaded with all this nonsense about MJ-12, and he's out talking to this one rancher in the area, Harold Dunning, and Dunning kind of blows him off and doesn't want anything to do with him, and Steinman interprets this to mean he's got something to hide. I'm thinking Dunning's just really tired of people showing up at his house asking about this fake UFO crash. And things like that, but he brings in some of the the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, IPU, which by the way shows up in the latest document. But the IPU, which did exist, but it was the Internal Processing Unit, I think. It had to do with the old IBM computers in the late 1950s, early 1960s. Those things, the card sorter things, punch card thing. That's what it had to do. It had to do with that. They bring that into that, and Steinman in his book brings in the IPU and all of this other ancillary stuff that has nothing to do with it. He's got pictures of an aviator who was killed in an aircraft accident in, I think, 1948. It's called the Tomato Man picture, and they said, here's a picture of the dead alien, and you look at it and you find these really Earth-based aviator glasses near the body. The head is expanded, but what you find out, and now we get into disgusting detail, what you find out is human bodies, when exposed to great heat, the head tends to expand. And if you put the fire out fast enough, it doesn't explode, because if you don't, and then you have a headless body. So he published pictures like that in there, and all this other nonsensical stuff. And I don't think many people thought much of the story. But then you get the Scott Ramsey, and I guess his wife Suzanne Ramsey is from the area, as was Monte Shriver, by the way. Monte Shriver, who's the guy on my show that debunked the whole thing, he was going to high school in 1948 in Aztec, New Mexico, so he was right there. But they go back into there, and they're spending an awful lot of time and money down there talking to people, and they've got a couple of alleged first-hand witnesses and things like that in their book. But they really don't provide the evidence that we would need to go beyond that. Shriver, when he did my program, and I've discussed this on my blog, which is www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com, talk about this. Nolan story doesn't hang together because he said he was working for the El Paso Natural Gas Company, for example, in 1948, but El Paso Natural Gas didn't get there until like 49 or 50. There's a picture of drip tanks near where this UFO supposedly crashed, the big tanks, and in the book it's kind of confusing whether or not the picture, well, the picture is not from 1948, but it kind of suggests it is, but the drip tanks weren't there in 1948. So you've got all these kinds of problems with the story, and given that, I just don't buy it. I know Frank Warren, who I find as a very fine young man. I shouldn't say young, fine man, and he does the UFO Chronicles website.
Oh yes.
He buys into Aztec. He believes it to be true. I think that if you take a look at the whole story from the first column that Scully wrote, Frank Scully wrote in Variety, I think it was Weekly Variety at the time. I don't know when it switched over to anything, but he had a column about 3 flying saucer crashes and the column comes out in 1948, but none of them is in Aztec. And he's kind of making fun of the whole thing. And then in 1950 he comes out with the book about which features the Aztec crash. But there's just really not any good solid evidence for that. And a number of the people have come forward to suggest that they were participants in it or heard the story from people who were participants in it just don't hang together. And the one I think of, there was a guy named Donald Bass, I think it was, and they called him Sam because Sam Bass was the great, outlaw from the 19th century. But he was supposedly killed in a traffic accident in Vietnam, and that was why you couldn't interview him. Well, I went to the wall the Vietnam Memorial Wall, because you have a list of everybody who was killed in Vietnam on the wall, and his name isn't there. And I looked at
even if it was killed in they were killed in a traffic accident.
Everybody who died in Vietnam's name is on the wall. If you died of a heart attack, if you committed suicide, if you were struck by lightning.
Yeah. Okay.
I think there's 58,000 people who died in Vietnam, Americans who died in Vietnam. Of those, I think 47,000 were killed in combat, and the other 10,000 died of other causes while serving in Vietnam. So, but his name's not on there. Well, they say, well, you go to their website and say, well, we think we have everybody, but we might have missed a few people. I'm thinking, how come it is every time I want to look somebody up on this wall, or look somebody up who military records, I cannot find the reference. And the flip side of that is when Don and I had done a book, done the second Roswell book, we just put a footnote about a guy named Frank Duran. No, Frank. I forget his name was Duran. His name was Duran, and Carl Flock challenged us on this and said, well, we can't find any reference. And I went back to a number of sources. I couldn't find any reference. And I finally found his name. He was a lieutenant colonel, and I actually found him in a reference book of retired officers. And so, I was able to verify the guy had been in the military, unlike so many others that we cannot verify were in the military. So, we've got Nolan, who claimed he was working on the El Paso natural gas pipeline, and his two pals who were with him, they were both dead before the Ramseys could interview him. They talk about a police officer who was had seen something, but I think they got the information from like a fourth cousin twice removed or something, which is not really reliable information. But a lot of stuff like that. And to their credit, in the book, the first one at least, they were talking about this preacher who was supposedly consulted about the alien bodies or something. And when the Ramseys went to talk to him, he said it never happened. And then they published, well, the guy said it never happened. We think it did, but he claimed it never happened. But there's just really nothing solid to put your finger on. They say, well, and it says in this document, this latest MJ-12 document, that the UFO was being tracked by 3 radars, and that caused it to crash. And I'm thinking, my God, you've traveled interstellar distance and a radar beam brings you down? I don't think so. But in this document, it says the radars were all located in southwestern New Mexico. And I'm thinking, yeah, well, if it's in southwestern New Mexico, given the terrain, that there's mountains between where the radars were and Aztec where it crashed, you're not going to see this thing at very low altitude. And so there's another reason, you don't think this document is false. But the idea that the thing was brought down by radar is just preposterous.
Well,
there's just so many things wrong with the story.
Yeah, no, that does come up. I've heard the radar thing a number of times, and the only thing that I could possibly think how that could happen, it would be something that they could not expect, to encounter, and the way their ability to move is somehow affected by that. That's the only thing that could possibly.
A radio beam? Space,
I don't know.
Space is filled with radio beams.
Okay, so we'll cancel that part. But the one thing I thought about,
pulsars are throwing them out.
I thought about the crashes is, the Earth is 70% water. So are these things supposedly are they crashing here? And if they are actually crashing here, wouldn't a lot of them crash in the water? That's.
I would argue that the difference is the interesting stuff is on the dry land.
Yeah.
So I'm an alien visitor. I want to look at the civilization. I want to look what's going on dry land. I'm not screwing around over the Pacific Ocean, watching great parts of water. And of course, we have the Shag Harbor crash where it did actually fall into the water. So
right. Yeah.
But I would think that if I'm an alien visitor, I'm not looking at the forests of Brazil. I'm not looking at the Sahara Desert. I'm looking at the areas that would be of interest to me as an alien visitor, which would be the civilizations, and not just in the United States, of course, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia. I might not hang around much in Antarctica because it's pretty cold there. And we'd look at Australia just so they wouldn't feel left out. But I mean, that's what I would be looking at. I'd be looking at the areas of interest. And if I was an alien visitor, especially in 1947, the place I'm going to be looking is in New Mexico, because we're firing rockets into the sky there. We're testing atomic weapons there. We're doing all kinds of that sort of thing. And if I'm an alien visitor and I know how warlike the humans are, the Terrans are, I'm going to want to make sure they pose no threat to me with their rockets and their atomic weapons. And I get to New Mexico and I discover, they managed to get one up 35 miles into the atmosphere. Yeah, that's going to bother us. So, it turns out we're not much of a threat to anybody outside of the planet Earth. I mean, our one space probe, which finally may have gotten outside the limits of the solar system,
yes,
will contact the first next star system in 87,000 years. That's not much of a threat.
I know.
So you have to look at it that way. These guys are no threat. Let's go home.
I had an astrophysicist on that was explaining that our trip to the moon was so minuscule, in proportion to anything else. It's like, an eighth of an inch or something like that compared to the next planet and all that. And I think we only have about 5 or 6 minutes left here, and I wanted to tell you what do you think, or I wanted to ask you what do you think about a situation like this, where a book is written, then a story's told, and another book is written, and all of a sudden, fake becomes fact in a lot of people's eyes. It keeps going. There's no way to stop something like this once the ball is rolling, is there?
Probably not, but I do something called chasing footnotes. And so I'll be reading a book and there's a footnote, and I will check to see where the sources of the information was, and then check those sources and check those sources. And one of the best examples of that is there is the story. I was looking for any story of disc-shaped craft that preceded Arnold, mentioned in the newspapers or whatever. And Frank Edwards had said that there was a story from an engineer in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, who had seen 9 disc-shaped objects flying across the atmosphere on June 23rd, the day before Arnold's sighting. And I thought, this is great. This is exactly what I want. And so I tried to chase the footnote down, and I found the reference in Dick Hall's UFO evidence, and gave me some more references about that. I finally chased the thing down. I found the story in the Cedar Rapids Gazette, but it turns out it was printed on the Friday after the Arnold sighting. The engineer didn't live in Cedar Rapids. He lived in Peoria, Illinois, and he said nothing about the sighting until after the Arnold sighting had appeared. So this sighting that had been sourced in a number of different books as a sighting that predated Arnold, showing this shaped craft from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, turned out to be, he wasn't an engineer either. He worked for the railroad, but he wasn't an engineer, and he didn't live in Cedar Rapids, and he didn't tell the story until after the Arnold story appeared in the newspapers. So it doesn't make the story untrue. It just makes the importance of the story much less because it happened after Arnold.
Right. Well, it's kind of like along the lines of, when the Alexander the Great UFO sighting supposedly, well, that originates from a 1950s novel. But that's almost becomes fact. A lot of people, when you say, oh yeah, Alexander the Great, had a UFO sighting, their shields in the sky and all that. There's so many people that believe that, and there's no control. And I think as time goes on, I think that, it's going to be harder and harder to, weed out, the real stories.
The problem.
Go ahead.
The problem is you go to the internet and you're looking for something specific. You find what you're looking for, and you're happy. You don't say, what's the source of this information?
Yes.
Can I trace it back to its origin? And what I found any number of times when I've tried to chase the footnotes back from source to source to source, it turns out that it's something completely different. And another example, in Dolan, in his book, one of his books is talking about the information that Bill Brazel had said, and quotes from Bill Brazel. And he gives the source as Stan Friedman's book, Crash at Corona. Well, the problem with that is the information didn't originate there. It originated with Don Schmidt and me, and it was in our first book. And so Dolan references Friedman, who doesn't give credit to us. And so the original source of the information is sort of obscured. I still have the tapes. I still have the transcripts of that interview with Bill Brazel, that original interview with Bill Brazel. And that's the other problem. Sometimes you don't get to the original source through the footnotes. There's other cases where, I've traced it from book to book to book to book, and finally got to the original source and found out the story is somewhat different than what was originally printed. And a lot of people don't do that because they think that the writer of that article or that book has done that work. Tried to trace the source down, and they don't think that maybe they just picked it up from some other book and they didn't bother to verify that information. That was how I got onto Willingham, by the way. I was doing the UFO crash when UFOs fall from the sky, and I was doing the Del Rio UFO crash, and I thought, is there anything new on it? So I typed Willingham's name into the internet and found out there was a whole different story, and began tracing all that information. And that was how I got onto Willingham, not being who he said he was, because I was trying to find the original source and how these things differed from one another.
Do you think that a lot of people will see a footnote and just say, "Oh, good, there's a footnote, so it must be right," or do you think that's where it stops?
I don't think people, I try to now heavily footnote everything and get it back to the original source, but I think people might look at the footnotes or just ignore the footnotes. I try to put fun stuff in the footnotes too.
more nuggets. So that
more little nuggets hidden in the footnotes, that sort of thing. But I think people look at the footnote and they don't say, well, okay, this guy did his research, and they don't go to the original source. And so that was the problem I had, like with the one footnote in Dolan's book. It didn't get us back to the original source. There was another point where he referenced a UFO sighting that took place at the time of the RB-47 case in 1957, and he referenced Good's book. I went to Good's book, and he referenced a book by the Lorenzens, Coral and Jim Lorenzen, and I went to their APRO newsletter and found that information, but I also went to the NICAP investigator for the same time frame and discovered the information. What they thought it was a UFO approaching an aircraft turned out to be a near miss by two aircraft. And one of the reports said an unidentified aircraft, and everybody just assumed an unidentified flying object. And so we get back to the original source, and we discover that it wasn't a UFO case. It was two aircraft in a near collision, and one of them was unidentified in the original story, and we originally got the identity of both aircraft, and we knew that it didn't take place near Fort Worth as they claimed. It really took place near El Paso, Texas, which is like 9 billion miles from Fort Worth.
Well, Kevin, hey, it's been great, and I really, really appreciate it. Always fun to talk with you, and I appreciate your good work.
And we filled up the 2 hours.
We did, easily. So again, you mentioned your blog site. Go ahead and throw that out there again, and tell us when your show's on again, because you have Jan Harzen on talking about MUFON, and I know you're going to be asking him some tough questions. So let's hear about that.
The blog is www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And if you've got a specific question about a specific case, there's a search engine there. You can type in a keyword and it'll bring up the objects I've done on it. If you're really interested in the MJ12 documents, I did Roswell in the 21st Century, and it's got a 50-page appendix about MJ12 from the very beginnings and how this whole thing evolved. The radio show is on the X Zone Broadcast Network. It's xzbn.net. You go on there, you can click on it, you can find all the shows. We all appear on YouTube, so you just type in A Different Perspective, Kevin Randle, and type in Jan Herzog, for example, Harzan, John Harzan's name, and it'll bring up the shows I've done with him, or a whole list of other shows like that. You can get a list of the shows on X Zone Broadcast Network, and it airs Saturday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, I believe. So, and you can get a list of the stations it appears on and other platforms it appears on at the X Zone Broadcast Network.
Very good. Okay, Kevin, can you hang in through the outro here? I want to talk to you quickly before we say goodnight.
Okay.
All right. So thanks so much. I really appreciate it. All right, everyone. So thanks for listening. Thanks for listening live and being in the chat room. I appreciate all your questions and everything. And don't forget, we're going to be back next Wednesday at 1 to 3 p.m. That's EDT, Eastern Standard Time. And that's going to be here on Podcast UFO or on YouTube. You can watch them both live then. And Philip Mantle will be on. We're going to be talking about tabloids and so much more. So that is it for the show. And thanks so much. And remember to keep your eyes to the sky.